Welcome to the deep dive. Our source material today is, well, it's pretty dense. We're looking at Canadian federal draft legislation, plus multiple provincial budgets for 2025 and 2026. So if you're looking for a shortcut to understanding Canada's financial landscape, you are definitely in the right place.
You really are. Our mission today is to analyze how Canadian governments are basically trying to fight on two different fronts at the same time. It's a fascinating contrast.
It really is. On one hand, you have these very specific, hyper-localized affordability measures.
Exactly. Things like rent credits or small income tax cuts, all the levers a government can pull to try and lower costs at your kitchen table, really. It's all about fighting that sticky inflation we've been seeing.
And then on the complete other end of the spectrum, you've got this high-stakes international drama.
Geopolitical trade disputes, the threat of U.S. tariffs, and this massive, incredibly complex rollout of a global corporate minimum tax. It's a huge deal.
So this deep dive is all about pulling those two threads together. We want you to see how all these levels of government are responding at once, trying to help family budgets, while also, building up our economic defenses against these huge global risks.
That balance is everything. It's the key to understanding where Canada's heading over the next couple of years. We're going to look at how this all impacts your personal financial planning right now and what it means for the long-term competitiveness of the Canadian economy.
Okay, let's start with the federal foundation then. There's a structural change here that's going to touch every single taxpayer.
Yeah.
The personal income tax rate shift. It sounds small, but it adds up.
It does. It's a subtle but pretty significant piece of draft legislation from the federal government. They've decided to reduce the lowest personal marginal income tax rate,
Which currently sits at 15%.
Exactly, 15%, and they're rolling this out in 2 stages.
And as we always see with Canadian tax, the changes almost never line up neatly with a calendar year. So what's the timeline look like here?
You're right to flag that. The legislation is set to take effect mid-year on July 1st, 2025. So for the 2025 tax year, your rate is actually going to be a blend of the old 15% and the new rate.
Which works out to?
It works out to a blended rate of 14.5% for 2025. But then the full reduction kicks in for the 2026 tax year and every year after that.
And that's when it drops to the full new rate.
Correct. For 2026 onward, that lowest marginal rate settles permanently at 14%. The goal is pretty clear. It's meant to be substantial, permanent tax relief, especially for lower and middle-income Canadians.
That reduction, when you look at it over time, really does accumulate. And that brings us right to personal financial planning. Let's get into the key limits for 2026, because these are the numbers you need to be thinking about now. Let's start with the RRSP, the Registered Retirement Savings Plan.
Okay, so the RRSP dollar limit for 2026 is getting a noticeable bump. It's projected to hit $33,810.
That's up from what, about $32,500 in 2025?
Exactly, up from $32,490. This increase is it's tied to the growth in average industrial wages, but we always have to stress the big caveat here.
Right. This is the part that trips people up. That big number isn't necessarily your number.
Not at all. Your actual contribution room is still strictly limited to 18% of your prior year's earned income. So for 2026, it's based on your 2025 income. For most Canadians, their personal maximum will be, quite a bit lower than that $33,810 figure.
So it's more of an economic indicator than a personal target for most people.
It is. It shows the economy is growing, but unless you're a very high earner, you won't be able to use that full amount.
Okay, let's move to the other big savings vehicle, the TFSA, the tax-free savings account.
And here, thankfully, we see some nice predictability. The annual TFSA contribution limit is holding steady at $7,000 for 2026.
But the really mind-blowing number is the cumulative total, isn't it?
It's staggering. For someone who's been eligible since the TFSA was introduced back in 2009, and, say, they've never contributed a single dollar, their total available contribution room is going to hit $109,000.
$109,000, wow.
Yeah, think about that. $109,000 of investment room where all the gains are completely shielded from tax. That can be used for, well, anything. A down payment, a business venture, a major boost to your retirement. It's an incredibly powerful tool.
We also need to hit the updates for the Canada Pension Plan and employment insurance. These are critical numbers for anyone running payroll and for high earners planning their cash flow. What's the CPP picture for 2026?
For the Canada Pension Plan, the YMPE, that's the year's maximum pensionable earnings, is projected to increase pretty substantially to $74,600. That's up from $71,300 in 2025.
But that's not the whole story anymore, is it? There's a second layer now.
Exactly. The real story here is the full implementation of that second tranche of contributions. It's part of the CPP enhancement, which is designed to eventually increase the maximum CPP retirement pension by 50%.
So how does that second tranche, or second ceiling, work in practice for 2026?
Well, it creates a new earnings band. So earnings that fall between that standard YMPE of $74,600 and the new year's additional maximum pensionable earnings, which is projected to be $85,000.
Okay.
That slice of income will be subject to a second, slightly lower rate of contribution. It means high earners will contribute more than they ever have before.
Which might sting a bit on the paycheck.
It might, but it's important to remember this isn't just a tax. It's a direct investment in a stronger, more secure public pension for themselves down the road. It's a contribution that leads to a delayed but increased benefit.
Makes sense. And what about employment insurance? What numbers do employers and employees need to watch there?
The maximum annual insurable earnings for EI are also climbing. They're set to reach $68,900 in 2026, which is up from $65,700 in 2025.
And what does that mean for the actual deduction?
It means the maximum premium an employee pays will increase slightly. It moves from $1,107.48 to $1,123.07 in 2026. These are, pretty standard adjustments reflecting wage inflation, but they're necessary planning figures for every single business.
Okay, so let's move beyond those broad limits and look at some highly specific federal measures. These are aimed at supporting certain groups and maybe cleaning up some complex regulations. Let's start with this brand new refundable credit for frontline staff, the Personal Support Workers Tax Credit.
This is the PSWT, and its introduction is really a signal from the federal government that they're trying to address the chronic staff shortages and low wages in the care sector.
Who exactly is it for?
It's designed very specifically for the staff who provide that essential one-on-one care to help people maintain their health and safety.
And what's the value? And maybe more importantly, what are the eligibility rules? Because these things are usually pretty strict.
They are very strict. The value is set at 5% of their eligible earnings, up to a maximum credit of $1,100 a year.
Okay, $1,100. And the eligibility.
It's very focused. The person has to be providing that one-on-one care in a place like a hospital, a nursing home, a residential care facility, or a home health care setting. And this is the crucial part. The support they provide has to be directed by a regulated health professional. Their main job duties have to be helping patients with daily living activities.
So it's not a general health care credit?
Not at all. It's for very specific direct care workers.
I have to ask, $1,100 is obviously helpful, but when you think about the intense labor shortage and the high cost of living, is that really a major incentive? Is it enough to be a real injection of support?
That's a very fair question. And look, while $1,100 provides definite relief, especially for a lower-income worker who gets the full refundable amount, you could argue its primary purpose is more about political signaling and financial recognition.
Acknowledging the work.
Exactly. It acknowledges the value of the work, but it doesn't fundamentally change the economic landscape for that worker. It's not a structural wage increase.
What's fascinating to me here is how this federal program interacts, or maybe clashes, with what the provinces are doing. There's a big catch, right? This credit isn't available everywhere.
This is a perfect example of the complexities of federal-provincial coordination. The PSWT credit is not available in British Columbia, Newfoundland and Labrador, and the Northwest Territories.
And why is that?
Because those jurisdictions have already signed separate multi-year bilateral agreements with Ottawa. Those agreements dedicate substantial federal funding specifically to provide direct wage increases for these exact same workers.
Ah, so the support is still flowing, just through a different pipe.
Precisely. In those places, it's often flowing in a more direct structural way, right onto their paychecks, not through a tax credit you claim at the end of the year. This approach prevents double dipping, but it also shows you the different ways governments are trying to solve the same problem.
Okay, next up, a measure that is going to be a huge relief for property owners and tax professionals. The definitive end of the underused housing tax, the UHT. This thing has been a mess since day one.
A complete mess. The federal government is officially eliminating the UHT, but only for the 2025 calendar year and all the years after that. It was brought in to curb foreign speculation, but the rules were so broad and so complex.
It caught so many regular Canadians in the net.
It really did. Thousands of Canadians, people who were trustees, partners in a family partnership, executors of an estate, suddenly had to file these annual nil returns, creating this massive, expensive administrative burden. The government figures this repeal will save about $30 million a year, mostly by just getting rid of the compliance costs for people who never owed the tax in the first place.
But while getting rid of it is great news, a lot of people got hit with huge penalties for simple filing mistakes in those first few years. Why wait until 2025 to repeal it? And are those people off the hook for the past?
That is the critical point to hammer home. The government realized this was a massive overreach, but it took them a long time to fix it, and the repeal only applies going forward from 2025 on.
So if you get a penalty notice for 2022,
You still have to deal with it. Absolutely all UHT obligations, filing the returns, paying any associated penalties and interest, they all remain fully in effect for the 2022, 2023, and 2024 calendar years. The repeal only stops the future bleeding. It doesn't fix the past damage.
ouch. Okay, let's look at another area of reform, one that's complex but necessary. Streamlining the rules for registered plans, specifically for investments inside your RRSP and TFSA. It sounds like they're cleaning house on what's considered a qualified investment.
This is a long overdue cleanup, really. It's in response to years of feedback from the industry. The current rules are they're scattered all over the Income Tax Act. The government is now consolidating the qualified investment rules for 6 different types of registered plans into one single unified definition.
So it should be easier to figure out what you can and can't hold in your account.
That's the goal. They're reorganizing the list of qualified investments and the regulations by asset class, which should make things a lot clearer for financial advisors and for you as an investor.
But the biggest structural change seems to be getting rid of the need for certain funds to register directly with the CRA. Can you explain the system they're repealing and what's replacing it?
For sure. They are repealing what was called the registered investment regime. This required certain funds to specifically register with the CRA under a part of the Act. It's being repealed as of January 1st, 2027. And frankly, it was just an unnecessary layer of bureaucracy, especially if these funds were already heavily regulated somewhere else.
So what's the new system?
The new system relies on existing and very robust market regulation. Going forward, the government will permit units of a trust to be a qualified investment without needing that special CRA registration, as long as that trust is either subject to the rules of National Instrument 81102 or it's an investment fund managed by a registered investment fund manager under National Instrument 31103.
Okay, let's unpack those acronyms for people who aren't specialists. NI 81102 and NI 31103. What are those?
Think of them as the rule books for the entire Canadian asset management industry. NI 81102 is what governs things like governance, valuation, and sales practices for publicly offered mutual funds, ETFs, that kind of thing. It ensures a high level of transparency and investor protection.
And the other one, 31103.
That one dictates who can register as an investment fund manager. It's the framework for the professionals who actually manage the funds, making sure they meet all the standards for suitability, compliance, and fiduciary duty.
So the government is basically saying, if the securities regulators say it's safe for the public, it's safe enough for a registered account.
Exactly. It removes a redundant layer of tax compliance by trusting the existing stringent provincial and national securities regulations. It avoids duplicating effort.
Makes perfect sense. Now, we touched on this briefly, but let's expand on Quebec's move to wind down certain tax credits as part of their simplification effort, specifically the elimination of the tax shield.
Right. Quebec is taking a very deliberate look at their tax system and trimming things that are either obsolete or just not working as intended. Starting in 2026, they're getting rid of the tax shield.
What was that designed to do?
It was a complex, refundable tax credit. The idea was to help stabilize the financial position of low-income workers by offsetting any provincial income tax increases they might face if their earned income went up. It was meant to be an incentive to work more.
So if the goal was to encourage work, why scrap it?
Well, the minister basically concluded that it was so complex that most people couldn't understand it or access it properly. And ultimately, it just wasn't achieving its main goal of significantly incentivizing work. It was a big administrative headache for a very limited impact.
And they're getting rid of another one too, right?
Yes. Also, starting in 2026, they're eliminating the non-refundable tax credit for municipal political contributions. That's really just a move to standardize how all political donations are treated for tax purposes. It's all part of this broader shift away from overly complex, targeted credits and towards more streamlined income support.
That sets the stage perfectly for our provincial deep dive. We've seen the feds focusing on streamlining and some baseline affordability. Now let's see how two very different provincial economies, Saskatchewan and Manitoba, are tackling these issues. We'll start with Saskatchewan's very growth-focused budget. What's the economic backdrop there?
Saskatchewan is really operating from a position of fiscal strength, and that's rooted in its resource economy. Their 2025-26 budget is projecting a modest but stable $12 million surplus.
And their credit rating is strong.
Very strong. They hold the second highest credit rating and the second lowest net debt to GDP ratio among all Canadian provinces. That signals a high degree of stability, and they're using that stability to fuel some really aggressive growth. Their real GDP growth is estimated at 1.8% in 2025, which is third highest nationally, and they expect that to climb to 2.0% in 2026, which would put them in second place.
And that growth isn't just on paper, right? It's being driven by massive capital projects.
Absolutely. The government is tracking about $41.2 billion in 72 large-scale projects that are either underway or in the final planning stages. This is an abstract growth. It's focused on mining, oil and gas, and, very importantly, value-added agriculture projects, turning raw materials into higher-value products right there in the province.
So they're clearly trying to keep that momentum going through predictable business policies.
For sure. The biggest move there is confirming the stability of their small business tax rate. There is talk it might revert back to 2%, but this budget confirms it will permanently stay at the current, very competitive rate of 1%.
And what does that mean in dollars and cents?
That single measure saves over 35,000 small businesses more than $50 million every year. That's fundamental stability for their local economies. They also brought in a powerful new incentive for bigger investments, the Small and Medium Enterprise Investment Tax Credit.
What does that do?
It offers a very generous 45% non-refundable tax credit for equity investments into eligible manufacturing and processing businesses. This is clearly targeting the sectors they want to grow and encouraging private capital to pour in.
This focus on growth seems to be mirrored by an equally aggressive approach to individual affordability. They're using something called the Saskatchewan Affordability Act to deliver some major tax cuts.
They are. They're delivering over $250 million in tax savings in 2025-26 through these initiatives alone. And you have to remember, that's on top of the more than $40 million in savings residents get just from the standard annual indexation of the tax bracket.
Right, which just protects them from inflation, pushing them into a higher bracket.
Exactly. So these new measures are pure additional relief.
And they're calling this the largest tax reduction since 2008. What makes it so significant?
It's historic because of how they're doing it. They're tackling income tax exemptions head-on. They're raising 4 key exemptions all at once: the basic personal amount, the spousal amount, the dependent child amount, and the senior supplement.
And how much are they going up by?
Each one will increase by $500 annually for the next 4 years. And again, that $500 increase is over and above the normal annual indexation. The policy goal here is to significantly slash the tax burden on low and modest income residents and seniors.
So what's the relatable impact of that? Sometimes these tax exemption numbers just sound like noise.
The government put out a really compelling data point. A family of 4 earning $100,000 a year will save over $3,400 over the next 4 years.
That's a real number.
It is. And even more significantly, once this is fully implemented over the 4 years, they estimate that over 54,000 residents will no longer pay any provincial income tax at all. It's a very clear, very aggressive signal that Saskatchewan wants to be a low-tax destination to drive both retention and migration.
And beyond that broad income tax relief, they also brought in a very targeted measure aimed at fertility and family planning.
That's the new fertility treatment tax credit. It's a 50% refundable credit, and it applies to one lifetime fertility treatment expense claim. The maximum eligible expense is $20,000.
Meaning a maximum $10,000 refund.
Exactly, a $10,000 refund per claimant. This is a huge benefit designed to lower the barrier to what are often necessary but incredibly expensive treatments. And importantly, taking this provincial credit doesn't stop you from also claiming eligible expenses under the federal medical expense tax credit.
Okay, let's shift to capital spending. This budget is clearly backed by some serious infrastructure investment, especially especially in health and education.
It's a record capital budget. Health capital spending alone went up by $140 million to a total of $657 million. That's the highest it's ever been. And the focus is really strategic. It's about enhancing patient access and expanding specialized services.
What kind of services?
Well, they're heavily recruiting specialists in pediatric care, endocrinology, respirology, palliative care to make sure kids can get care locally. They're also investing in higher volumes of specialized medical imaging like CT, MRI, and PT-CT scans with the specific goal of cutting down those notoriously long waiting lists.
And what about expanding services outside of the big cities into more rural areas?
That's where the kidney health programs come in. They're adding 30 full-time positions across 7 rural and regional locations, places like Meadow Lake and Moose Jaw, to bring care closer to where patients live. They're also using technology, expanding their Healthline 811 virtual ER physician program to at least 25 smaller rural emergency departments that often face service disruptions.
So using virtual access to bridge the physical gap.
Precisely. It's a modern approach to rural service delivery.
And what about education?
The investment in K-12 is robust. The budget includes $130 million to fully fund the new teacher bargaining agreement. And on the support side, they're delivering 50 more specialized support classrooms, which is a direct response to what educators have been asking for to help manage challenging behaviors.
And school buildings.
The school capital budget is $191 million, and that includes crucial pre-planning for new schools in fast-growing Saskatoon communities like Kensington and Aspen Ridge.
Finally, for Saskatchewan, let's touch on the significant commitments they're making to community safety.
This is a really high priority area for them. They're committing $6 million to help hire about 100 new municipal police officers. But the most interesting piece here is the acceleration of the Saskatchewan Marshals Service. They're funding 50 new positions, and the service is expected to be up and running months ahead of schedule.
Now, what exactly is the purpose of the Marshal Service? How is it different from the RCMP or local police?
Well, the Marshals Service is designed to be a dedicated provincial resource that fills the gap between the RCMP's federal focus and municipal police mandates. They're tasked with targeting issues that cross jurisdictional lines, things like organized gangs, illegal drug trafficking, and rural property crime. They're meant to be specialized, highly mobile, and proactive.
And they're also targeting the source of some of these community issues, like nuisance properties.
Correct. They're hiring 14 new people for their Safer Communities and Neighborhoods, or SCAN teams. These teams use civil law to target and shut down properties that are hubs for illegal activity, disrupting the whole ecosystem of crime at a very local level.
That's a fascinating and comprehensive strategy, very focused on growth and population retention. Now, let's turn to Manitoba. Their budget has a very different feel. It seems less about expansion and more about immediate resilience against these high-level external threats, specifically from the U.S.
That's exactly right. Manitoba's economy is deeply, deeply linked to the U.S. They do about $39 billion in trade with the states every year. So the threat of tariffs is, well, it's an existential risk for their manufacturing and agricultural sectors. Their whole narrative is about strengthening Canadian supply chains and building economic independence.
And they already saw a direct benefit from one of their affordability measures last year, right?
You did. In 2024, Manitoba had the lowest inflation rate of any province, just 1.1%. And the government explicitly credits the temporary gas tax holiday they brought in for that success. So in response, this budget is really focused on keeping costs down for consumers and strategically diversifying their trade pathways.
What's their economic outlook look like amid all those headwinds?
It's respectable. Real GDP growth is projected to speed up from 1.1% in 2024 to 1.7% in 2025, and they expect to hold that rate in 2026. They are running a deficit for 2025-26, about $794 million, but the plan is to shrink that with a target of getting back to a surplus by 2027-28.
So let's compare their affordability strategy to Saskatchewan's. Manitoba seems to be targeting the fixed costs of living, not broad income tax cuts. What are the key measures?
Right. They're taking that temporary gas tax holiday and making it permanent. A permanent 10% cut to the provincial fuel tax on gasoline and diesel effective January 1, 2025. That's a direct move to keep transport costs down. They're also keeping a 1-year hydro rate freeze in place, shielding people from rising utility costs.
And what about targeted housing relief?
They're incrementally boosting tax credits that are tied directly to housing costs. The renter's affordability tax credit max goes up from $575 to $625 in 2026, and the homeowner's affordability tax credit is also going up by $100 from $1,500 to $1,600. And that one is specifically aimed at reducing the burden of school taxes on property owners.
So very targeted cost of living reductions, not the big income tax cuts we saw in Saskatchewan.
Exactly, different tools for different situations.
I noticed some significant family support measures in their budget too, especially around childcare and health access.
The expansion of $10 a day childcare is a massive deal for families. They're extending it to include non-school days, holidays, and PD days. The government figures that will save families who use the service an extra $2,808 a year.
Wow.
Yeah. They also made the Universal School Food Program permanent, which is often called Nello's Law. And they're expanding the free birth control program to include Plan B contraception, which they frame as a move to expand reproductive rights and remove a major barrier to health care for women.
Now let's connect back to that bigger picture of trade. How is Manitoba actively trying to, bulletproof its economy against potential U.S. tariff shocks?
They know they're vulnerable, so their response is two-pronged: financial triage for the short term and strategic infrastructure for the long term.
Okay, what's the triage?
For immediate help, they've set up a $100 million targeted business support program for firms that are most exposed to trade risks. They also gave an extra $100 million of loan authority to the Manitoba Development Corporation to help those companies pivot their supply chains or production if they have to.
That sounds like defense. What about the offense? The long-term strategic move away from relying so heavily on the U.S. border.
This is the bold move. They've allocated $36.4 million over 2 years to significantly develop the Port of Churchill, which is Canada's only northern deep-water port, and the Hudson Bay Rail line that connects to it.
So this is about creating a whole new trade route.
It's a clear, long-term infrastructure play to strengthen Canadian supply chains, reduce dependence on U.S. rail corridors, and open up market access to Europe and Asia through Arctic routes. It's an assertion of northern sovereignty and economic resilience. They're also cutting the payroll tax to help businesses stay competitive at home.
And tell us about Manitoba's record capital plan.
It's the largest in their history, totaling $3.7 billion. This includes core infrastructure like 11 new schools, 3 new personal care homes, and major highway improvements. On the healthcare side, they've focused heavily on staffing. They added over 1,200 net new frontline healthcare workers in the past year.
And they're adding more training spots.
Yes, 176 new training seats this year, including 20 new doctor residency spots and, critically, 100 healthcare aid spots specifically for northern Manitoba, where the need is most desperate.
We have to address the new revenue measure, though, the one that's going to impact a lot of businesses. The tax on cloud services.
This is a major structural shift in how Manitoba taxes the digital economy. Effective January 1st, 2026, the provincial sales tax, the PST, will now apply to cloud computing services.
How broad is that definition?
It's very broad. It includes software subscriptions like software as a service or SaaS data storage and remote computer processing. The government is basically arguing that because these services use data infrastructure in the province, they need to contribute to revenue just like traditional services do.
What's the practical impact of taxing these essential digital tools?
Well, it creates a new compliance headache for thousands of businesses, especially smaller firms and startups that are built entirely on cloud services. While it does raise revenue for the province, it could also be seen as a drag on digital adoption, increasing the cost of doing business for pretty much every modern company.
And a quick final note on community safety in Manitoba.
The budget invests an extra $25 million in provincial policing. And a significant chunk of that, $5 million, is dedicated to border security, to stop illegal crossings, and, crucially, to try and curb the flow of fentanyl trafficking.
Okay, we've covered the very different strategies in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. Let's do a sweep across the other major provinces, focusing on the really targeted changes in Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia. We'll start with Ontario.
Right. Ontario is projecting a pretty hefty deficit, CA $14.6 billion, so that really limits their ability to do major broad-based tax cuts, so no new taxes or tax increases for people, but their strategic focus is laser-like. It's all about incentivizing domestic manufacturing.
And why the intense focus on manufacturing right now?
It's all tied to the race for electric vehicle supply chain dominance. The government wants to anchor the future of EV battery and component manufacturing right there in Ontario. To do that, they are significantly enhancing the Ontario-made manufacturing investment tax credit.
How significant of an enhancement are we talking about?
For Canadian-controlled private corporations, the refundable rate jumps from 10% to 15%. That raises the maximum credit from $2 million to $3 million a year. And they're also expanding it to non-CCPCs like the big global companies by offering a new 15% non-refundable credit. It's a massive financial signal designed to attract and keep that large-scale industrial capital.
They're also supporting a very specific, almost old-school piece of infrastructure.
Right.
Short-line railways.
They are. They're bringing in a new 50% refundable tax credit for maintenance on these short-line railways. These little lines are crucial feeders into the main rail network, especially for resources and industrial goods, so this investment shores up a critical bottleneck in the supply chain.
On the personal side, Ontario, much like Saskatchewan, is stepping up to help families with fertility costs.
Yes, they're introducing a 25% refundable tax credit for eligible fertility treatment expenses, starting in the 2025 tax year. It covers up to $20,000 in annual expenses, which means a maximum credit of $5,000. And just like in Saskatchewan, you can claim this on top of the existing federal and provincial medical expense credits.
And finally, for Ontario, a big consumer-focused change is coming to their alcohol policy.
This is all about stimulating competition. Effective August 1st, 2025, they're making major reductions in the basic tax rates. For example, the tax on spirits sold by Ontario distillers from their own shops is being cut in half, from 61.5% down to 30.75%.
And will that saving actually get to the consumer?
Well, the government says it will issue a directive requiring the LCBO to match these tax cuts by lowering their own markups. So theoretically, the savings should be passed directly to you at the checkout. We'll have to see.
Okay, moving over to Quebec. We're seeing a combination of trying to harmonize with the feds and bringing in some new environmental fees.
Quebec is all about simplification and alignment right now. They've announced they plan to harmonize their capital gains inclusion rate with the recent federal change, raising it from 50% to 66.7% on gains over $250,000 for individuals. The effective date on that is still up in the air, though, which creates some planning complexity.
And then there's the interesting shift on electric vehicles. After years of incentivizing EVs, Quebec is now introducing fees for them.
They are. Starting January 1, 2027, they're bringing in an annual fee, $125 for a fully electric vehicle and $62.50 for a plug-in hybrid. At the same time, they're raising the threshold for the luxury vehicle tax, but, and this is the key part, they're getting rid of the exemption for EVs and hybrids from that luxury tax.
What's the thinking behind, well, penalizing the adoption of green vehicles?
The government is arguing it's about fairness and the sustainability of road funding. As more people switch to EVs, they buy less gasoline, and the gas tax is what pays for road maintenance. So these new fees are meant to make sure all road users, no matter how their car is powered, contribute fairly to keeping up the infrastructure. It's a shift from subsidization to internalization of costs.
Finally, let's look at British Columbia, where tax policy is squarely focused on trying to curb housing speculation in the middle of an extreme affordability crisis.
BC's main tool here is their speculation and vacancy tax, the SVT. And because the housing crisis is so severe, particularly around Vancouver and Victoria, the government is cranking up the rate significantly starting in 2026. For foreign owners, the rate will rise to 3%.
And what about Canadian citizens and permanent residents who own vacant homes?
They're seeing a hike, too. For Canadians, the rate is doubling from 0.5% to 1%. The message from the government is crystal clear. They are fully committed to using the SVT to curb speculation, and every single dollar raised is earmarked for affordable housing projects in the province.
Okay, that wraps up our domestic tour. Now we have to turn to the highest stakes global financial drama impacting Canada, starting with the very messy saga of the Digital Services Tax, or DST.
The DST was a massive point of conflict. Canada enacted a 3% tax on revenues from large digital service providers and, critically, made it retroactive to January 2022. This was aimed squarely at major foreign tech companies, many of them U.S.-based. It was meant to be a stopgap measure to make sure they paid their fair share until a global deal was reached.
But the U.S. applied immediate and very heavy pressure. What exactly did they do, and why did Canada back down so fast?
The U.S. response was brutal and effective. On June 27, 2025, the U.S. president announced he was terminating bilateral trade talks with Canada, specifically saying the DST unfairly targeted U.S. firms like Meta and Netflix. The threat of that trade disruption was just too high.
So to get back to the table, Canada had to give in.
Essentially, yes. Just 2 days later, Canada announced it had halted collection of the DST and would move to formally repeal the tax in the fall. It really highlights the difficult position Canada is in when facing a protectionist U.S. administration. We had to choose stability in our most vital trading relationship over our own unilateral tax policy.
The DST issue might be resolved for now, but that fundamental risk, the reliability of the U.S. as a partner, is still front and center.
Yeah.
And that leads us directly to the next high-stakes moment. The formal review of the USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement.
This is the crucial event on the calendar for every North American manufacturer and exporter. The formal review kicks off on July 1st, 2026. And this review is now expected to be a very contentious negotiation where the U.S. will almost certainly try to extract major concessions from both Canada and Mexico.
What are the main ways this could play out?
Well, analysts are looking at two likely and not very ideal scenarios. The first is a simple renewal, which is now seen as the least likely option. That would just be a straightforward extension with minor updates.
And the second, more painful pathway.
That's the painful extension. This is the scenario where Canada and Mexico feel they have to offer up significant concessions to the U.S. to prevent tariffs and get the deal extended. In that outcome, the U.S. could force much stricter rules of origin, especially for the auto sector, which would directly hit Canadian manufacturing jobs.
What are the specific sticking points that are going to define these talks?
There are three big ones. First, energy. Mexico's nationalist energy policies are a major problem for the U.S. and could stall the whole review. Second is digital trade. The U.S. has backed away from some of its earlier commitments, while Canada and Mexico are pushing hard for clarity on things like cross-border data flows.
And the third issue connects all of this directly to global geopolitics, the China question.
Correct. The U.S. has made it clear it wants to use the USMCA review to force its partners into closer alignment with its policies on China. Canada has mostly been in line with the U.S., but Mexico has been courting Chinese investment, and that divergence is going to be a major point of confrontation in the 2026 talks.
Shifting now from trade disputes to global tax harmonization. Canada has formally moved ahead with the global minimum tax, or Pillar 2. This is arguably the biggest international corporate tax shift in decades.
It is historic in its scope. Canada's Global Minimum Tax Act received royal assent in June 2024, and the core purpose is actually pretty simple: to make sure that large multinational corporations, those with annual revenues of $750 million or more, pay a minimum effective tax rate, or ETR, of 15% on their profits in every single jurisdiction where they operate.
So how does the system actually make sure that 15% is met globally? We hear all this jargon like IIR and QDMTT.
Well, the main tool is the Income Inclusion Rule, or IIR. This rule says that if a multinational subsidiary in a low-tax country is paying less than 15%, the parent company, which is usually in a higher tax country, has to pay a top-up tax to bring that subsidiary's weight up to 15%. It basically removes the incentive to shift profits to tax havens.
And what's the QDMTT?
That's the Qualified Domestic Minimum Top-Up Tax. This lets the local government, so let's say Canada, collect that top-up tax domestically first. It ensures that if a Canadian subsidiary of a global company falls below 15%, Canada gets the revenue, not the foreign parent company's country. It protects our tax base.
What's the timeline on this, and what's the compliance burden for these massive companies?
The rules are generally effective for fiscal years that began on or after December 31st, 2023. The first returns and any potential top-up taxes are due as early as June 30, 2026.
The source material calls this an enormous data challenge. Can you put that in context for us?
Imagine trying to file a single ultra-complex tax return for a company that operates in 50 different countries at once, but you have to use a brand new set of accounting rules designed just for this tax. That's what they're facing. They have to gather massive amounts of data on a per-country basis and do these incredibly complex calculations. It's an administrative Everest for their compliance teams over the next 2 years.
Finally, let's wrap up the federal corporate tax changes by looking at how the government is trying to spur domestic investment.
Right. They're proposing new measures to speed up capital cost allowance deductions. Specifically, they're offering immediate expensing for new manufacturing and processing buildings. This lets companies deduct the full cost of a new M&P building right away instead of depreciating it over many years, which is a big incentive to build now.
And there's a key change to transfer pricing rules.
Yes. They're modernizing these rules to align Canada better with OECD guidelines. The big change is that they're emphasizing the economic substance of a transaction, not just its legal form. This is meant to stop creative accounting, where the legal structure of a deal might hide where the value is actually being created, ensuring taxes are paid fairly in Canada.
And a quick note on luxury items.
The government is eliminating the luxury tax on aircraft and boats, trying to boost those sectors, but the luxury tax is staying in place for high-end vehicles.
So after all that, what does this all mean? We have seen governments aggressively fighting inflation with permanent gas tax cuts, huge provincial income tax reductions, and these very targeted credits. At the same time, they're navigating a global stage defined by protectionist threats and implementing the biggest corporate tax shift in history.
The synthesis is really clear. Canadian governments are trying to manage two different timelines. In the short term, they have to provide immediate cost relief. That's where you see the hydro freezes, the gas tax cuts, the income tax reductions, especially in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. But on the long-term timeline, they need to build economic resilience.
Which is where things like Manitoba's Port of Churchill project and Ontario's manufacturing incentives come in.
Exactly. And the federal adoption of Pillar 2 to stabilize global tax revenues. Different provinces are using different tools based on their unique economic strengths and vulnerabilities.
And that provincial contrast is exactly where we need to end. For you, the listener, trying to figure out where you can afford to live and work, these provincial tax cuts, no matter how generous, have to be measured against the single biggest cost you face: housing.
And that's where the data provides a powerful and pretty sobering final thought. To truly understand affordability, you have to look beyond just income taxes and include the cost of housing. Let's look at the inner-city comparison data for 2025. Take a single person earning $60,000 and renting. In Regina, their total annual cost for taxes, utilities, and housing is about $18,723. That ranks fifth best in affordability.
Now compare that to a major financial center.
Toronto, by contrast, is the most expensive city in that set. The same person faces an annual cost of $28,225. That's a gap of nearly $10,000. That's not an abstract number. That's a year's worth of student loan payments or your entire emergency savings.
And it gets even more dramatic when you scale it up to a family.
For a family of four earning $150,000 in renting, Regina ranks number 1 for affordability with a total annual cost of $31,552. In Toronto, that same family faces a cost of $51,764. The gap widens to over $20,000 a year.
So this raises the final provocative question for you to think about. Considering these massive persistent cost differences in housing, will the generous provincial tax credits we're seeing in places like Saskatchewan actually be enough to counteract those huge housing price gaps and meaningfully influence where people choose to live and work in the future? You now have the full context, from the personal tax rates to the global trade wars, to start exploring that question for yourself.